Dad's hand on my shoulder was a promise. "You're safe now," he said, his gaze as steady as a signature on a contract. That evening, in our kitchen, the wooden spoon broke in half. My stepmother did not. The next morning, I entered Cyrilline Systems, where she is the CFO and I am the lead risk analyst, with a plan she would never see coming. I didn't choose violence. I chose the ledger. My name is Harper Lane. I am 28 years old, and my life is a ledger of carefully managed risks. The afternoon sun in Everwind was weak, the color of diluted tea. It filtered through the thinning leaves of the oak tree in our backyard, dappling the flagstone patio with shifting patterns of light and shadow. My father, Richard Lane, stood over the gas grill, the chrome hood still warm but the flames long dead. The last of the hickory smoke curled into the cooling air, a ghost of the meal we had just shared in near silence. He turned to me, his face a mask of earnest concern that didn't quite reach his eyes. He placed a hand on my shoulder, the weight of it both a comfort and a cage. "You're safe now," he said. The words were meant to be a foundation, a bedrock of paternal protection. Instead, they hung in the air like the smoke, formless and fleeting. I watched his gaze flicker past me, toward the house, toward the kitchen window where a silhouette stood watching. I am a risk analyst. I deal in probabilities, in quantifiable threats, in data points that form a pattern. My father's promises were qualitative, anecdotal. They had no place on my spreadsheets. I gave him a small, tight nod, a gesture I had perfected over the years. It was an acknowledgement, not an agreement. As he turned back to scrape the grill grates with a wire brush, the sleeve of my blouse hitched up, exposing the edge of a violent bloom of purple and blue on my forearm. I quickly, smoothly, pulled it down, the soft cotton a flimsy shield. The smell of hickory smoke mingled with the faint, chemical scent of the dish soap Celeste favored, a lemon and rosemary blend that was supposed to evoke a sense of clean, organic living. It smelled only of antiseptic control. From the kitchen window, Celeste Rowan waved. It was a small, precise gesture, a queen acknowledging her subjects from a distant balcony. Her smile was perfectly composed, the same one she used in quarterly reports and board meetings. It was the smile of a chief financial officer who had just successfully navigated a hostile audit, a smile that revealed nothing and conceded even less. It never reached her eyes. Her eyes were chips of cold slate, constantly assessing, calculating. I knew that smile. It was the prelude to a correction, a balancing of accounts that always left me in the red. I turned away from the window, focusing on the rhythmic scrape, scrape, scrape of my father's work. He was a good man, I believed, but his goodness was a passive thing. It was a quiet wish for peace, not an active fight for it. His desire for a tranquil life had made him a collaborator in its absence. In my mind, a line of code executed, a simple, cold assertion. Safety equals F data, evidence. It was not a feeling. It was not a promise spoken over a dying fire. Safety was a number, an incontrovertible proof point. It was an audit trail, a sentence, spoken by a man who flinched at raised voices, meant nothing. Later, the house was submerged in the thick, artificial quiet that Celeste cultivated. The dishwasher hummed its monotonous cycle, the only approved sound after 10 p. I had come down for a glass of water. The glass was in my hand, cool and sweating, when she appeared in the kitchen doorway, a wraith in a silk robe. She didn't speak at first, simply stood there, her presence sucking the air from the room. The accusation was for a transgression so minor I couldn't immediately identify it. A coffee mug left on the counter, a book placed spine up on the end table. It didn't matter what it was. The purpose was not correction. It was control. "We've spoken about this," she said, her voice a low murmur, a sound engineered not to carry, not to leave witnesses. She picked up a heavy wooden spoon from the ceramic crock by the stove. It was old, worn smooth from years of my mother stirring sauces in this very kitchen. I said nothing. My training, both professional and personal, was to remain silent, to observe, to collect data. Speaking introduced variables, emotions. Emotions were liabilities. She stepped closer, the polished limestone cool beneath my bare feet. You are a disruption. Harper, a loose variable in a closed system. Her movements were economical, precise. The spoon came down on my arm, the one already bruised. The sound was a dull, heavy thud. It struck again, on my shoulder, and again, on my thigh. It wasn't a frenzy of anger. It was a calculated application of force, a physical audit. On the fourth strike, against the hard bone of my forearm, the spoon's handle cracked. A sharp, splintering sound echoed in the silent kitchen. It broke in two. She looked at the splintered wood in her hand, then at me. Her expression one of mild annoyance, as if a favored pen had run out of ink. She dropped the pieces on the counter. They clattered, unnaturally loud. She leaned in, her breath smelling of mint and something metallic, like old pennies. Her whisper was a razor. Your very existence is a risk. Then she was gone, her silk robe whispering against the doorframe. I stood there, the cool glass of water still in my hand. I did not cry. Crying was a non-performing asset. Instead, I began to count, anchoring myself to the data. I counted the ragged, shallow breaths I took as my body fought against shock. 37. I counted the number of steps it took to get from the kitchen, up the stairs, and to the safety of my bedroom door. 12. I closed the door. The click of the latch, a small, satisfying sound. I did not look at the new marks. I already knew what they would look like. I had a portfolio of previous examples stored in a secure cloud server, each image file named by date and time. The alarm on my phone chimed at 5 a.m. By 6, I was walking through the glass and steel lobby of Cyrilline Systems. The air was chilled, smelling of industrial cleaner and ozone from the servers one floor below. My employee ID card was a cool, hard rectangle in my hand. I swiped it over the reader at the security turnstile. The machine emitted a sharp, clinical beep, and the barrier slid open. The sound wasn't just permission to enter. It was the starting gun. The project had commenced. In the empty elevator, my reflection was stark against the polished steel walls. A young woman, 28 years old, in a tailored gray blouse with long sleeves. Her back was straight, her chin level. Her expression was neutral, betraying nothing. She looked competent. She looked controlled. She looked like someone who belonged here, in this building dedicated to mitigating corporate threats. The woman in the reflection was an asset. The girl who had counted her breaths in the dark was a liability I kept locked away. I stepped out onto the 14th floor, the executive suite. The carpet was thick, muffling my footsteps. A few early risers were already at their desks, the glow of their monitors casting a pale blue light in the pre-dawn gloom. As I passed Celeste's corner office, I saw her through the floor-to-ceiling glass wall. She was on the phone, one hand gesturing decisively, the other holding a Mont Blanc pen like a scepter. One of the VPs passed me in the hallway, nodding a deferential good morning to her through the glass. He smiled at me. Morning, Harper. The CFO's in early. No surprise there. She's a machine. I gave him my practiced, agreeable nod. She sets a high standard. He saw a machine. The board saw a genius. My father saw a wife who kept a beautiful, quiet home. No one saw the hand that held the pen, the same hand that had gripped a wooden spoon. They saw the public filings, the impressive earnings reports, the clean audits. They didn't see the private ledger, the one written in bruises and fear. I sat down at my desk, the leather of my chair sighing softly. The city was beginning to wake up outside my window, a grid of glittering lights against a dark sky. I powered on my laptop. The boot-up sequence was swift, efficient. I navigated to my secure personal drive, a partitioned section of the server that only I could access. My fingers moved across the keyboard, the clicks soft but deliberate. I created a new directory. I paused for a moment. Considering the name, it had to be precise. It had to be accurate. It had to define the project's ultimate objective. I typed the name, Project Safety. I hit enter. The empty folder appeared on my screen. A blank slate. A new ledger waiting for its first entry. The game had begun. Celeste was an expert at balancing books, at hiding liabilities in plain sight, but I was the one who designed the systems to find them. And I would audit her life down to the last, damning decimal point. Cyrilline Systems was a monument to corporate perfection. Our public-facing identity was built on the phrase, compliance by design, a mantra repeated in every press release, every shareholder meeting, every glossy brochure. We sold impenetrable security software to enterprise-level clients, many of them government contractors with non-negotiable regulatory requirements. Our brand was trust. Our product was certainty. We didn't just meet industry standards, we set them. The 14th floor was the heart of this pristine image. A quiet, climate-controlled space where risk was not just managed but theoretically eliminated before it could be conceived. My domain was a specific and sensitive ecosystem within this larger one. Internal controls for the Government Contracts Division. I was the gatekeeper, the one who ensured that our multi-million-dollar agreements with agencies like the Department of Defense and Homeland Security were hermetically sealed against fraud, waste, and abuse. I audited payment flows, verified vendor credentials, and stress-tested our reporting frameworks. My job was to find the hairline fracture in the foundation before it could compromise the entire structure. I was, in Celeste's own words during my performance review, exceptionally meticulous. The first anomaly was a name, Rowan Advisory LLC. It appeared on a vendor payment ledger during a routine Q3 audit. The name was a small, quiet bell ringing in the back of my mind. Rowan, it was too close. In a company of 30,000 employees, coincidences were possible, but my entire profession was built on the premise that they should be investigated. I cross-referenced the LLC's registration documents. It was a single-member corporation, registered in Delaware 2 years prior. The registered agent was a generic corporate services firm, a dead end by design, but the name itself was the thread. I pulled the payment records. Rowan Advisory LLC was classified as an independent consultant, providing strategic compliance oversight on a new Department of Energy contract. The fees were substantial but spaced out, never large enough to trigger the highest level of automated scrutiny. The payments were authorized, consistently, by the CFO's office, by Celeste. I narrowed my query, searching for specific invoices from the vendor. My system returned 2. They were for the same project code, submitted 2 weeks apart. Both invoices listed Phase 2 Compliance Framework Analysis as the service rendered. Both were digitally signed by C. Rowan, but they weren't identical. One was for $86,500. The other was for $88,230. A difference of $1,730, precisely 2%. It was a classic technique. A 2% variance is a rounding error in a multi-billion-dollar corporation, a statistical ghost that rarely flags in high-level automated audits. It's a number designed to be invisible, but I wasn't a high-level audit. I was a deep dive. I saved both PDFs to the project safety folder, naming them Invoice Variance and Invoice B Variance. A pattern began to emerge, not just in the data, but in the corporate atmosphere around me. 3 times in the past 2 months, I had submitted preliminary risk assessments to Celeste, flagging potential minor inconsistencies in vendor payment protocols, and 3 times, the weekly executive operations meeting, where I was scheduled to present my full findings, had been abruptly rescheduled at the last minute. The official reasons were always plausible. A key stakeholder had a travel conflict. An urgent client matter arose, but the correlation was perfect. My report goes in. The meeting gets pushed. It was a clear signal. My work was being monitored, and my trajectory was being managed. The confirmation came on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in the sterile corridor outside the Human Resources Department, having just dropped off some new hire paperwork for a junior analyst on my team. Celeste was walking out. She stopped, giving me her impeccable public smile. Several HR managers were within earshot. "Harper, there you are," she said, her voice warm and authoritative. I just wanted to commend you on the Q3 preliminary reports. Your attention to detail is a genuine asset to this company. Truly meticulous. Thank you, Celeste, I replied, my voice level. I just follow the data. That you do, she said. The HR people smiled and nodded, basking in the glow of executive approval. Celeste took a step closer, lowering her voice to a confidential murmur, a sound meant only for me. The smile on her face didn't change, but her eyes went cold. A word of advice, though it's possible to be too meticulous. Some threads aren't meant to be pulled. Don't dig too deep. She patted my arm, the same arm that still held a faint, yellowish trace of a bruise, and walked away. The threat was delivered as a compliment, a piece of career advice. It was a masterclass in corporate intimidation. I went back to my desk and created a new text file. I recorded the date, the time, 14:32, the location, HR corridor, and the exact phrasing of her words, both the public praise and the private warning. I noted the flat, fluorescent lighting and the low hum of the ventilation system. Emotional data was still data. A threat, delivered with a smile, was a critical incident. It was an admission of risk. It confirmed my hypothesis. There was something to find. That evening, as I was running a final data sweep before heading home, my phone buzzed on the desk. It was a text from my father. Everything okay at work? Celeste mentioned you were working very hard. Don't want you to make her angry. I stared at the message. He was a proxy, a channel. His concern was genuine, but the message itself was an extension of her control, reaching from her corner office into my private life. She was using my father as a tool for plausible deniability, a way to pressure me off the record. I took a screenshot of the text. I marked the file, red flag external influence, and saved it to my project folder. My father's plea was now just another data point in a growing mosaic of interference. The time for manual review was over. It was time to deploy the tools I had built for exactly this kind of situation. I opened a secure terminal and activated a script I had written myself. I called it Round Trip Pi. It was a simple but powerful piece of code designed to do one thing: hunt for circular transaction patterns. It analyzed payment outflows and charitable donation records, searching for money that left Cyrilane and, through a series of shell companies or third-party entities, eventually found its way back, often disguised as a tax-deductible contribution or a clean investment. It was a digital bloodhound for money laundering. I configured the script, setting Rowan Advisory LLC as a primary node in the search algorithm. I added other parameters, including date ranges and specific transaction thresholds designed to filter out noise. My fingers flew across the keyboard, the commands precise and economical. I took a deep breath and hit execute. The script ran in silence. There were no dramatic progress bars, just a blinking cursor and a black terminal window. My laptop's fan kicked in, a low whir as the processor worked through terabytes of financial data. Cross-referencing ledgers, vendor databases, and the public filings of our corporate charity. For 10 minutes, nothing happened. I sat there, watching the blinking cursor, my own heartbeat a steady, measured rhythm. Then the output appeared. It was a flowchart, a clean, stark visualization of a transaction chain. The lines and arrows on my screen were an indictment. Money flowed from Cyrilane Systems to Rowan Advisory LLC in the form of consulting fees. From Rowan Advisory, a nearly identical amount, minus the 2% variance, was then transferred to a second, smaller LLC I hadn't seen before. From that second entity, the money was then donated to Cyrilane Cares, our philanthropic arm, the public face of our corporate soul. From there, the funds were reabsorbed into the company's general revenue pool, coded under a miscellaneous income category that was effectively a rounding error in the company's massive cash flow. It was a perfect closed loop, a round trip. Celeste was paying herself, using a shell company that bore her own name, skimming 2% off the top, and then laundering the rest back into the company through our own charity. She was using our commitment to corporate social responsibility as the final rinse cycle for her fraud, the logo for Cyrilane Cares, A stylized image of two hands holding a green sprout seemed to mock me from the corner of the screen. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt a cold, quiet certainty, the kind that comes when a complex equation is finally solved. The perfect company was flawed. The incorruptible CFO was a thief, and the risk I represented to her was no longer a matter of suspicion or paranoia. It was a quantifiable fact. I had the numbers. I had the map. The audit had just begun. The architecture of corporate law is a beautiful thing. It is designed for clarity, for strength, for the unambiguous definition of right and wrong. But like any grand cathedral, it has its dark corners, its forgotten passages, its little bits of artful ambiguity left intentionally by the architects. At Cyrilline Systems, our most exquisite loophole was in the conflict of interest policy. Section 4, subsection B. The policy strictly prohibited doing business with any entity considered a related party, spouses, immediate family, and their associated businesses. It was a solid wall. But a few lines down, the definition of an independent consultant was a masterpiece of corporate vagueness, a gate left slightly ajar. An independent consultant, the policy stated, could be vetted and approved by a department head and the CFO, provided they offered a unique and indispensable service. Celeste, a master architect of her own impunity, had driven Rowan Advisory LLC straight through that gate. I found the records of the approval. It had been pushed through as a third-party vendor pre-vetted for urgent deployment. The justification document, signed by Celeste herself, was filled with jargon about agile compliance solutions and proactive risk mitigation, all of it amounting to a verbose nothing. She had declared herself indispensable to herself, and the system, by its own design, had agreed. The approval had, of course, gone through the company's ethics committee. I pictured the meeting. It would have been brief, efficient, and utterly devoid of ethical considerations. I filed a formal request through the internal portal for the meeting minutes, citing my role in auditing vendor procurement protocols. The official minutes document that was returned to me was a work of art in its own right, a haiku of corporate evasion. 6 lines long, it noted the date, the attendees, the proposal to approve Rowan Advisory, and the outcome. The 5th line was the most telling. Discussion. CFO, Rowan confirmed the vendor's independent status and unique qualifications. No further questions were raised. The final line read simply, "Motion carried unanimously." There was no record of who the vendor was, no mention of the shared surname, no attachments. It was a perfect record of a process that had never actually happened. This wasn't enough. It was circumstantial. I needed the full submission packet Celeste would have provided to the committee. I sent a follow-up request to the legal department, specifically asking for the vendor application file associated with the meeting. The response came from a senior paralegal, a man named George who was famous for his unwavering adherence to protocol. His email was polite, professional, and a solid brick wall. "Dear Ms. Lane," it began, "the materials you have requested are subject to confidentiality under Article 12 of the Corporate Governance Charter, which pertains to proprietary vendor relations. We are therefore unable to fulfill your request." Article 12. It sounded so official, so final. I looked it up. It was a real clause, but its application here was a deliberate misinterpretation, a weaponization of bureaucracy. Legal wasn't there to interpret the rules. They were there to enforce the will of the executive suite. The corporate channels were closed to me. Celeste had sealed them from the inside. It was time to go outside the system. That afternoon, I used a public library computer 2 towns over to access the website for a third-party corporate whistleblower hotline that Cyrilline contracted with. The service promised complete anonymity. I filed a preliminary report. I kept it vague but specific enough to be actionable, detailing a potential conflict of interest and financial irregularities involving a senior executive and an external consulting firm. I described the round-trip transaction flow in sterile, technical terms. I received a case number and a notification that an investigator would be assigned, but I knew this was only a first step. An anonymous tip could be dismissed as a disgruntled employee's grievance without hard, irrefutable evidence. They would need original server logs, unmodified financial records, authenticated communications. They needed proof that couldn't be explained away. I needed to get them the contents of my project, safety folder, but I had to do it in a way that was forensically sound. The next piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected place: the physical access logs for the data center. As a risk analyst, I had clearance to review departmental access to sensitive infrastructure. It was a routine part of my job, checking to ensure that only authorized personnel were entering secure areas. I ran a query on the server room on the sublevel, filtering for access outside of standard business hours over the past 3 months. I expected to see the names of the night shift IT engineers and security staff. I found them, but I also found another name: Celeste Rowan. On Friday, September 26th, at 22:41, she had badged into the main server room. She had stayed for 17 minutes. A CFO has no operational reason to be in a server room, surrounded by humming racks of blinking lights and chilled air. At nearly 11 o'clock on a Friday night, a CFO manages money, not machines. Her presence there was a profound anomaly, a data point that screamed from the page. It was the digital equivalent of finding a footprint at a crime scene. Now I had a when and a where. I needed to know what. What could she have been doing? The most logical answer was tampering with evidence. She knew I was getting close. She must have been covering her tracks. I dug deeper, this time into the system command logs for the finance servers, focusing on the time frame immediately following her visit. I was looking for large-scale file deletions, altered records, anything out of the ordinary. At first, I found nothing. The logs were clean, too clean. It was as if the 17 minutes she was in that room had been surgically excised from the record. Then I had an idea. A direct deletion would be crude, easy to spot for a trained investigator. Celeste was not crude. She was elegant. She would automate it. She would build a tool. I expanded my search, looking not for deleted files, but for new scripts, new automated tasks that had been created and scheduled to run on the server. And there it was. A scheduled script, set to run every Friday at 2300. It was a simple data purging script designed to overwrite specific server log files, the very logs that would document her fraudulent transactions, with meaningless junk data, then delete the originals. It was a digital self-cleaning oven. The name of the script was Hygge Ush. I stared at the name, a cold, bitter laugh catching in my throat. Hygge, the Danish concept of warmth, coziness, and contentment, a feeling of comfortable conviviality. She had named her evidence-destroying malware after a word for feeling safe and snug at home. It was the most cynical, arrogant thing I had ever seen. It was her signature. The final piece fell into place when I checked the user credentials of the account that had created and scheduled the script. It didn't belong to a system administrator or an engineer. It belonged to a marketing intern. An intern would never have the clearance or the knowledge to write and deploy such a script. I ran the name through the HR database. Finn Rowan. His emergency contact was listed as Celeste Rowan. His relationship to her, nephew. She hadn't even bothered to use a cutout. She had used her own family, a low-level, expendable employee who would have no idea what he was actually doing, just that he had to run a file for his aunt. It was sloppy, and it was the first real mistake she had made. In the weeks that followed, I became a ghost. I perfected the art of smiling in meetings. I took meticulous notes, asked intelligent but non-threatening questions, and delivered my reports on time. I was the image of a diligent, loyal employee. I used my own professional competence as a cloak, my quiet efficiency making me invisible. People don't suspect the person who does their job perfectly. They look for the disgruntled, the loud, the disruptive. I was none of those things. But while I was nodding along to presentations about quarterly earnings, I was mapping out the server architecture in my head. While I was having polite conversations by the coffee machine, I was mentally rehearsing the command line sequence I would need. The work happened at night, long after the cleaning crews had gone, and the building had settled into its deep, humming slumber. I would log in remotely from my apartment using a multi-layered VPN. I couldn't risk downloading the data. That would create a network log that could be traced back to me. I needed a perfect, untainted copy of the original. I found what I was looking for in the system's backup protocols. The servers created a shadow copy, a snapshot of the entire file system, every night at midnight for disaster recovery purposes. These copies were stored for 72 hours before being overwritten. They were my target. On a Thursday night, 1 week after discovering the Higi script, I executed my plan. I accessed the previous night's shadow copy of the finance server. It was a pristine, read-only image of the system, created hours before Celeste's weekly cleanup script was scheduled to run. It contained everything: the original transaction logs, the invoices from Rowan Advisory, the payment authorizations with Celeste's digital signature, the creation log for the HiGGE script itself, tied to her nephew's user account. I didn't download it. I initiated a direct server-to-server transfer, sending the entire encrypted shadow copy to a secure, off-site cloud storage account I had created under a false name, paid for with cash using a prepaid debit card. The transfer was disguised as a routine data migration, a needle in a haystack of nightly data traffic. When it was complete, I downloaded the single, encrypted container file to a brand new, high-capacity external hard drive. I held the small, cool rectangle of plastic and metal in my hand. It was no bigger than a deck of cards, but it held the entire weight of my future and the destruction of hers. I plugged it into my laptop. The drive appeared on my screen with the default name, Untitled. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. This object, this collection of bits and bytes, was the culmination of everything. It was the counterweight to the broken spoon, the silent answer to my father's empty promises. I right-clicked, rename. I typed in the new name for the drive. It was not a project name. It was a statement of fact, an equation that had finally been balanced. The external drive, safety equals evidence, sat on my desk next to my keyboard. It was inert, a black plastic rectangle, but I could feel the density of the information it contained, a kind of gravitational pull. It was a complete record of a crime, a perfect, self-contained universe of data. Looking at it, I felt a memory surface, not with a rush of emotion, but with the quiet clarity of a restored file being opened. It was a memory of a different kind of record, a different kind of evidence. My mother died when I was 16. It was a car accident on a rain-slicked road. One moment she was here, her life a warm, chaotic presence filled with half-finished gardening projects and the smell of yeast from the bread she was always baking. The next, she was a file at the county records office, a death certificate with a cause and a date. My father, a man who had always navigated by her light, was lost. He drifted through our house like a ghost, his silence a heavy, suffocating blanket. 11 months after the funeral, Celeste appeared. My father had met her at a grief counseling seminar, a fact of such profound irony that I could never fully process it. She didn't move in. She executed a corporate takeover of our home. The comfortable, worn furniture my mother had loved was replaced with sleek, minimalist pieces in shades of gray and beige. The mismatched coffee mugs were boxed up and sent to Goodwill, supplanted by a set of identical paper-thin porcelain cups, crystal wine glasses, which we never used, lined the glass-fronted cabinets. But the most significant change was the imposition of a new, overarching rule. No noise. Laughter was too loud. Music was a distraction. The sound of my sneakers squeaking on the newly polished hardwood floors was an irritation. The house became a museum of a life, not a place where one was lived. When I started applying for colleges, Celeste held a family meeting at the new glass dining table. It felt like a performance review I was destined to fail. She reviewed my grades and my list of state schools with the detached air of an auditor examining a flawed expense report. "Going to college is a luxury, Harper," she had said, folding her hands neatly on the table's surface. "A 4-year degree is an investment with a questionable return in this market. Your father and I believe a more practical path is in order." My father sat beside her. staring at his empty plate, silent. He did not object. He did not defend. He outsourced his parental duties to her with the same efficiency she applied to his finances. I did not argue. I simply adjusted my projections. I got a job bussing tables at a diner and another stocking shelves at a grocery store. I worked 70-hour weeks my senior year of high school, saved every dollar, and applied for every student loan and scholarship I could find. I bought my own laptop, my own books, my own freedom, one grueling hour at a time. The day I moved into my dorm, my father helped me carry my boxes. Celeste stayed in the car, on a conference call. She believed making things difficult would make me compliant. She had miscalculated. She had made me resilient. She had trained me for a war of attrition. 4 years later, I graduated with honors in finance and a specialization in forensic accounting. I had multiple job offers, but one stood out: a junior risk analyst position at a top-tier security firm called Cyraline Systems. The pay was excellent, the work was challenging, and it represented everything I had fought for. On my first day, I walked into the gleaming lobby and was told the CFO wanted to see me. I was brought up to the 14th floor, to the expansive corner office, and there she was, Celeste. She was already there, a senior vice president on the fast track, a respected figure in the corporate hierarchy. She had never mentioned it. I had never thought to ask. She stood up from behind her massive mahogany desk and gave me that precise, bloodless smile. "Harper," she said, her voice smooth and welcoming. "I was so pleased when I saw your name on the new hire list. Welcome to the family." It wasn't a welcome. It was a claim. She was reframing my victory as her own, absorbing my independent achievement into her sphere of influence. My hard-won sanctuary had become another room in her house, another space where she set the rules. In the years that followed, my father and I perfected our separate brands of silence. He chose his as a form of peacekeeping, a strategic retreat from any and all conflict. He saw her anger, her coldness, her casual cruelty, but he chose to believe it was a bearable cost for domestic tranquility. His silence was a concession. Mine was a methodology. I chose my silence to build a case file. The physical abuse began subtly, a grip on my arm that was too tight, leaving finger-shaped bruises, a shove in the hallway that was explained away as an accident, but it escalated, always in private, always without witnesses. After the first time, she struck me with an open hand, leaving a stinging red mark on my cheek. I knew I had to do something. Crying was pointless. Arguing was dangerous. Reporting it to my father was futile. So I turned to the only method I trusted: data collection. That night, I went into my bathroom, closed the door, and stood in front of the mirror. The fluorescent light was unforgiving. I held up my phone and took a picture of my face, my expression as neutral as I could make it. The red handprint was stark against my skin. I saved the image to a secure folder in a cloud account she could never access. I named the file with the date: YYYMDD. I added no description, no emotional commentary. The image was the data. It needed no interpretation. This became my ritual. Every time it happened, I would wait until I was alone, stand in front of that mirror, and document the damage: a split lip, a bruised jaw, the angry red welts left by a belt, the circular marks from where she had dug her fingernails into my arm. My body became a walking ledger of her violence, and my phone was the accounting tool. The folder grew, a silent, chronological record of her crimes. I learned to compartmentalize, to translate the pain into the sterile language of my profession. A night spent locked in my room was a containment strategy. A week of her silent, menacing glares was a period of heightened ambient risk. The bruises themselves were at-home incidents. The healing process was remediation. Using the language of the boardroom to describe the violence in my home didn't numb the pain, but it caged it. It turned the chaos of trauma into an ordered system of events that could be analyzed, tracked, and eventually acted upon. It made the unbearable feel manageable. Through this process of cold, methodical documentation, a fundamental truth began to crystallize in my mind. Celeste was powerful, but her power was entirely dependent on two things: the absence of witnesses and the integrity of her ledgers. In the quiet hallways of our home, she was unchecked because my father chose not to see. In the gleaming offices of Cyrilline, she was untouchable because she controlled the flow of information, ensuring her records were always clean. Her violence and her fraud were born of the same pathology, a desperate need for control, exercised in the dark. I needed to drag her into the light. I needed an audit. In my professional life, an audit was a tool of discovery. A harsh, focused light shone into a company's darkest corners to expose waste and corruption. I realized I could apply the same principle to my life. Both of her worlds, the domestic and the corporate, were vulnerable to the same forces: an audit and a witness. Both are blinding. One evening, while working late, I took a yellow sticky note from the dispenser on my desk. I wrote a single sentence on it, a distillation of my entire strategy, the core thesis of my project. I stuck it to the bottom of my monitor, a quiet reminder of the path forward. It was a truth I had learned in the most painful way possible, a truth that now guided every action I took. Abusers fear the minutes more than the prison. They don't fear the punishment as much as they fear the process. They fear the exposure, the official record, the documented, indisputable transcript of their actions. They fear the cold, hard evidence, presented in a quiet room, for everyone to see. Celeste had spent her life ensuring no minutes were ever taken. I would spend mine making sure every last detail was recorded, time-stamped, and entered into evidence. Safety equals evidence. The operation required a new stage, a different kind of venue. The battlefield of spreadsheets and server logs had yielded its initial results. But to build a truly unassailable case, I needed Celeste's own words. I needed to move her from her native environment of curated data and into the uncontrolled landscape of a live conversation. I needed to set a trap made not of code, but of compliance itself. I sent the invitation from my corporate email account on a Monday morning. The subject line was bland. Lunch invitation. The body was a model of professional deference. Dear Celeste, I wrote, I would be so grateful for the opportunity to learn from your experience over lunch sometime this week. Your strategic insights would be invaluable to my professional development. It was an appeal to her ego, an invitation to perform the role of magnanimous mentor. It was bait she was constitutionally incapable of refusing. She replied within minutes, Of course, let's do Wednesday. My assistant will find a time. Her assistant booked a table for two at the Meridian, a restaurant on the top floor of a downtown skyscraper. It was a place of polished chrome, dark wood, and hushed, important conversations. It was Celeste's territory, but I had requested a specific table when I first conceived of this plan, feigning a preference for natural light. Table 12. It was in a corner, flanked on two sides by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city and, more importantly, a perfect, mirror-like reflection of the table's occupants. I arrived exactly on time. Celeste was already there, a study in calculated poise. She was wearing a cream-colored silk blouse and a sharp black blazer, a string of pearls at her throat. She looked less like she was having lunch and more like she was about to chair an acquisitions committee. Harper, she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Thank you for this. It's important to foster talent from within. Thank you for making the time, I said, taking my seat. The tension between us was a physical presence. A third guest at the table, the waiter, sensing the corporate hierarchy, was obsequious to her and politely dismissive of me. We made small talk through the appetizers. She spoke of market trends and shareholder value. I nodded and asked carefully crafted questions, playing the role of the ambitious but slightly naive subordinate. I was drawing her in, establishing a baseline of a normal conversation, a normal power dynamic. It was during the main course, a ridiculously overpriced piece of seared tuna for her, a simple salad for me, that I made my move. Speaking of optimizing assets, I began, my tone casual, as if a thought had just occurred to me. I was so impressed by the tax efficiency strategy you implemented last quarter. The way the company leverages third-party advisory firms to streamline liability is just brilliant. It's the kind of thing they don't teach you in school. I watched her face, a flicker of something, suspicion, maybe pride, pass through her eyes before being suppressed. It's a standard practice for a corporation of our size. Harper, we seek out the best expertise. Of course, I said, taking a sip of water. I was looking at the vendor file for Rowan Advisory. For example, the framework they provided for the DOE contract was a masterclass in risk deferment. I said the name without any special emphasis, as if I were pulling a random example from a long list of vendors. Her posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. Her fork paused halfway to her mouth. You've been reviewing the vendor files? Just the payment ledgers, part of my quarterly audit. It's all very routine. She placed her fork down with deliberate precision. Rowan Advisory is a highly specialized, independent consultant. I'm afraid you misunderstand the function of such a third party in our capital structure. It's a far more complex arrangement than a simple payment ledger would suggest. The condescension in her voice was the hook. She was correcting me. She was asserting her superior knowledge. She was walking into the trap. Oh, I'm sure I do, I said, feigning mild embarrassment. I reached into my leather portfolio that sat on the chair beside me. Actually, that's one of the things I was hoping you could clarify. I pulled out a single-page document. It was a summary I had created, printed on Cyrilline letterhead, titled Q3 High-Value Consultancy Payments. It looked official. It listed a dozen vendors, their services, and the total payments made to them in the last quarter. Most of the data was accurate, pulled directly from the system, but in the line for Rowan Advisory LLC, I had planted a seed of disinformation, a deliberate error. I had listed the total payment as $206,500. The real number was $260,000. I had also fabricated a reference code, a meaningless string of numbers. I slid the paper across the table. I was trying to reconcile this summary for my internal report, and the numbers for Rowan Advisory seemed slightly off from the initial project budget. I'm probably just misreading the authorization codes. She picked up the paper, her eyes scanning the columns. A tiny, smug smile touched her lips. She had caught me in a mistake. She was back in control. Yes, you are misreading this. Your total is incorrect. I thought so, I said, my voice full of manufactured humility. The system can be tricky. The total disbursement for Q3 was exactly $260,000, she said, her voice sharp and precise. She was correcting the record. She was demonstrating her command of the facts. Then she went a step further, driven by an arrogant need to prove not just that I was wrong, but that she was infinitely more knowledgeable. And this reference code is completely wrong. It's not a project code. The payments are routed through our holding account for tax sheltering purposes. They should be logged to account number 7884B. There it was. The account number, 7884B. It was the account number of the secondary shell company, the one I had discovered with my round trip, Pi Script, the account that formed the bridge between Rowan Advisory and the Cyrilline Cares charity. It was a piece of information that existed nowhere in any official payment ledger accessible to me. It was a number only the architect of the fraud would know off the top of her head, and she had just said it out loud. I held her gaze, allowing a small, appreciative smile to form on my face. Ah, I see. That makes so much more sense. Thank you for clarifying. I picked up my pen and a small moleskin notebook from the table. I made a show of jotting down a note, my handwriting neat and steady. Statement 1. Extra documentary disclosure re. Account 7884B. As I wrote, my eyes drifted past her to the window. The city skyline was a blur, but the reflection was perfectly sharp. It showed the two of us at the table. Two women in a power play. It showed her, leaning forward, her expression one of confident authority. It showed me, head bowed, writing in my notebook, and it showed the slim silver pen clipped to the inside pocket of my blazer. The tiny, almost invisible microphone grill just below the clip glinting in the afternoon sun. The rest of the lunch passed in a blur. I don't remember what we ate for dessert. My mind was already processing the next phase. That afternoon, back at my desk, I drafted an email. The recipient was Celeste Rowan. CC'd was George from the legal department and the general counsel's office. The subject line: follow-up and clarification from our lunch. Dear Celeste, I typed. Thank you again for a most illuminating lunch. I wanted to summarize my key takeaway to ensure I understood correctly. You clarified that the payment variances for Rowan Advisory LLC were due to their funds being routed through a tax-sheltering holding account, specifically 7884B, for capital efficiency, a detail not reflected in the standard AP ledgers. Your clarification was immensely helpful. Best, Harper. It was a perfect corporate maneuver. It was polite, professional, and utterly devastating. It took her verbal, off-the-record statement and entered it into the official, written record. It created a time-stamped piece of evidence, and by copying legal, I had made it an official corporate communication that could not be easily deleted or ignored. Her reply came in less than 60 seconds. It was a single, frantic line, sent only to me. This is not for circulation. Recall the message immediately. I did not recall the message. I took a screenshot of her reply. I saved the original email and her response to the external hard drive. Her panic was a confession. Her demand for silence was an admission of guilt. The final confirmation came at 22:58 that night. I was logged into the system remotely, monitoring the server's scheduled tasks. I saw the alert, a high-privilege user account, the one belonging to her nephew. Finn had just modified a scheduled script, the Hig-Esh script, which had been set to run every Friday at 2300, was now scheduled to run daily at 0300. She knew. She didn't know how I knew, but she knew that I knew something. The lunch, the document, the email, it had all worked. I had rattled her cage, and her first instinct was to run back to the scene of the crime and try to scrub the evidence more thoroughly. But it was too late. I already had the original copy. All she was doing now was creating a new log file, a new piece of evidence that proved she had something to hide. The trap had been sprung, and now she was the one who was unsafe. Celeste's frantic change to the Hig script was a tactical error born of panic. It was a digital fingerprint left at the scene, a clear signal that she was actively concealing something, but it also told me she was growing paranoid. A paranoid opponent is a predictable one, and a predictable opponent, no matter how powerful, is vulnerable. Her power, I knew, was built on a network of control and intimidation. My path to victory, I realized, would be built on a network of my own, not of power, but of quiet, shared resentments. The first node in my new network was Finn Rowan, the marketing intern, Celeste's nephew. I had seen him in the hallways. He was young, barely out of college, with the perpetually hunted look of someone in over their head. He always seemed to be walking too fast, his shoulders hunched, as if trying to make himself a smaller target. He was a pawn, and it was time to let him know he had the option to leave the board. I orchestrated the encounter by the gourmet coffee machine on the executive floor, a place interns rarely ventured unless sent on an errand. I was ostensibly getting an afternoon espresso. I saw him approaching, carrying a precarious stack of presentation binders. I timed my pivot from the machine perfectly. Accidentally, my elbow nudged his arm. The binders tumbled, skittering across the polished marble floor in a cascade of paper and plastic. "Oh, I am so sorry," I said, my voice full of genuine-sounding apology. I immediately knelt to help him gather the mess. His ID badge, clipped to his belt, had come loose and clattered near my foot. "No, it's my fault. I wasn't looking," he stammered, his face flushing a deep red. He was flustered, terrified of being seen making a mistake in this high-stakes environment. I picked up his ID card and handed it to him. "Finn Rowan," I said, reading the name as if seeing it for the first time. "You're in marketing, right?" He nodded, his eyes darting around the hallway, expecting a superior to materialize and reprimand him. Yes, just for the summer. I stacked the last of the binders and handed them to him. You've been busy, I said, my voice low and conspiratorial. I've seen your user account in the system logs, running a lot of high-level maintenance scripts for a marketing intern. Higa, wasn't it? That's some pretty sophisticated work. Your aunt must be very proud. The color drained from his face. He looked like I had just read his private diary out loud. I don't know what you're talking about, he whispered, his voice trembling. Finn, I said, my tone shifting from casual to serious, but not unkind. It's okay. I'm not HR. I'm not your aunt. I'm a risk analyst. My job is to see things that don't add up. And a marketing intern with sysadmin-level privileges running a data-purging script on the finance server? That doesn't add up. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. She just told me it was a cleanup file, to free up space. She said to just run it when she told me to. And you did it because she's your aunt, and she got you this internship, and you don't want to get your family in trouble. I finished for him. It was a statement, not a question. He just stared at me, his eyes wide with fear and a dawning, horrified understanding. You're a tool, Finn, I said, keeping my voice soft. And when she's done with you, she will discard you. When this comes out, and it will come out, your name is the one on the logs. She will say you acted alone, that you were a disgruntled intern. She will ruin your career before it even starts to protect herself. Tears welled in his eyes. What do I do? You do nothing for now, I said. But you need to know there's a way to protect yourself. The company has a formal whistleblower policy. It's designed to legally protect people who come forward with information about misconduct. It shields them from retaliation. Your aunt is putting you at immense personal and legal risk. The policy is your shield. I was offering him the one thing she never would. Safety. I let the word hang in the air for a moment, then straightened up. Just something to think about. Be careful. Finn. I walked away, leaving him standing amidst the faint smell of spilled coffee and his own quiet terror. I had planted the seed. Now I had to wait for it to grow. My next target was Mirai, one of the senior night shift security engineers. She was a legend in the IT department, a brilliant but famously curmudgeonly woman who had been with the company for 15 years. I knew two things about Mirai. She was fiercely protective of her domain, the servers, and she had a profound, undisguised contempt for executives who treated her like their personal help desk. I had once seen Celeste snap her fingers at Mirai in the data center, demanding she investigate a slow connection on her home laptop, and the look of pure venom on Mirai's face was something I had carefully filed away. I found her in the deserted cafeteria at 1 a.m., during her lunch break, scrolling through her phone. I approached not as an executive, but as a fellow night owl. I placed a large, steaming cup of coffee from the good machine on her table. Thought you might need this, I said. It's the real stuff, not the sludge from the break room. She looked up from her phone, her expression a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. Lane, risk analysis. What do you want? A professional opinion, I said, sitting down opposite her. I'm running a routine audit on after-hours access to the Tier 1 servers. I've got a flag here. A C-suite executive accessed the main server room last Friday at 22:41. Celeste Rowan. Mirai snorted into her coffee. Her Majesty, yes, I remember, had to reset her access permissions because she'd forgotten her own PIN, wasted 20 minutes of my time. Corporate Security Policy 7.2.c requires a visual verification of any non-IT personnel accessing the server racks, especially after hours. I need to confirm what she was doing and if she brought any unauthorized hardware into the room. I need the camera logs for camera 14, time-stamped from 2240 to 2300 on the 26th. I paused, then pulled out my phone. I'm submitting the official IT support ticket for the request right now. Citing the policy, my name is on it. It's all by the book. A slow smile spread across Mirai's face. She understood immediately. This wasn't a shady request. This was me, a lowly analyst, officially weaponizing corporate policy against a CFO she despised. It was a beautiful, bureaucratic act of aggression. "By the book," she repeated, savoring the words. "I like that. I'll have the encrypted video file on your desktop by the time you get back to your office." The file was waiting for me. As promised, I double-clicked, and a grainy black and white video player opened. There she was. At 22:41, Celeste swiped her card and entered the server room. She was carrying a large black leather tote bag. She moved with purpose, walking to a specific server rack. She glanced around, then reached into the bag and pulled out a small black object, an external hard drive. The footage was clear enough to see her plug a USB cable from the drive into a port on the front of the finance server. She stood there for about 15 minutes, her back to the camera, then unplugged the drive, put it back in her bag, and left. It was the smoking gun, a physical act to accompany the digital crime. Just as I was saving a copy of the video file, an email notification popped up. It wasn't to my corporate account, but to the anonymous Proton Mail account I used for sensitive communications. The sender was an address I didn't recognize, a random string of letters and numbers. The subject line was one word: Huga. It was from Finn. The message was short and panicked. I looked at the script, the code. I know some basic programming. It does more than just delete. The first command isn't RAM, it's CP. It copies everything first. She made me run a test. There's a hidden directory on that server. /var log mirror. Look there. Please be careful. She's watching everyone. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was the final, critical piece of the puzzle. A mistake born of pure hubris. Celeste wasn't just destroying the evidence of her crimes. She was creating a secret, personal backup of it, an insurance policy, a kill file. And in her arrogance, she had used her terrified, tech-savvy nephew to do it, never imagining he would have the courage or the knowledge to understand what he was seeing. I logged into the server remotely, my fingers flying across the keyboard. I navigated to the directory Finn had named. It was hidden, its permissions cloaked to be invisible to normal system scans, but it was there, and inside it was a perfect, pristine archive of every single transaction log, every invoice, every payment authorization, and every email communication related to Rowan Advisory LLC. It was the entire conspiracy, meticulously preserved by the conspirator herself. I didn't just download it. I initiated a forensic bit-for-bit copy using a tool that would preserve all the original metadata, creating a perfect, court-admissible clone of the data. The progress bar crawled across my screen. When the transfer was complete, I ran a final command, a SHA-256 hashing algorithm on the entire dataset. The command returned a long, unique string of letters and numbers, a digital fingerprint of the evidence. I copied the hash into a new document, a digital affidavit, noting the date, time, and the source. The evidence was now tamper-proof. Its integrity was mathematically guaranteed. I leaned back in my chair. The safety equals evidence drive now containing the video file, the audio recording from the lunch, and the mirror directory with its unassailable hash. The case was no longer just strong, it was absolute. That night, I went home. I didn't work. I didn't review files. I drew a bath, put on some music, a quiet act of defiance against the rule of no noise, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I went to bed before midnight. I slept for 3 uninterrupted hours. It was the most rest I'd had in years. The hard drive safety equals evidence was a loaded weapon. The time for gathering intelligence was over. It was time to pull the trigger. On a Tuesday morning, at 9:00 a.m., I executed the final command. I composed a new email on my secure, anonymous Proton Mail account. The recipient was Arthur Vance, the retired federal judge who served as the independent chairman of Cyriline's audit committee. The subject was simple and direct. Whistleblower report submitted pursuant to Cyriline Systems Governance Policy 14.3. In the body of the email, I laid out the facts in the same sterile, dispassionate tone I would use for a standard risk assessment. I described a systematic, multi-year fraud scheme orchestrated by the chief financial officer, Celeste Rowan, involving shell corporations, invoice manipulation, and the misappropriation of charitable funds. I attached 4 files. The first was a PDF containing the full data from the Mirror directory, including the round-trip transaction flowchart. The second was the security camera footage of Celeste in the server room with the external hard drive. The third was a link to a password-protected cloud server where he could stream the full unedited audio recording of my lunch with Celeste. The password was 7884B. The final attachment was a text file containing the SHA-256 hash of the evidence, guaranteeing its integrity. I signed off not with my name, but with my official employee number. I hit send. The detonation was controlled, silent, and digital. The response was faster than I expected. 2 days later, a formal summons appeared in my inbox. It was from Mr. Vance's office. I was to appear before a closed door. Special session of the audit committee the following morning at 10 o'clock in boardroom C. The email stated that CFO Rowan would also be in attendance. Boardroom C was a cold, quiet cathedral of corporate power. The table was a single, massive slab of polished mahogany that seemed to absorb all sound. The leather chairs sighed as the committee members, 4 grim-faced, gray-suited men and 1 woman, took their seats. I sat at one end of the table, my laptop and a single file folder in front of me. Celeste sat at the other, flanked by the company's general counsel. She looked perfectly composed, projecting an air of weary annoyance, as if this were a frivolous distraction from her important work. She gave me a brief, condescending smile, a look that said, "You have no idea what you've just done, you foolish little girl." Arthur Vance, a man whose face seemed carved from granite, called the meeting to order. "Ms. Rowan," he began, his voice a low rumble that commanded attention. "This committee has received a serious and detailed allegation of financial misconduct. We are here to review the preliminary evidence and hear your initial response." Celeste laughed. It was a soft, airy sound, completely out of place in the tomb-like silence of the room. "Arthur, please," she said, her tone one of intimate familiarity. "We all know what this is, a malicious rumor, likely started by a junior employee with a grievance. I'm happy to address these baseless claims so we can all get back to work." Vance's expression did not change. He turned his gaze to me. "Ms. Lane, the floor is yours." I did not stand. I remained seated, my posture straight, my hands resting on my laptop. "Mr. Chairman, members of the committee," I began, my voice steady and even. "My findings are not based on rumor. They are based on a direct analysis of the company's own data." I presented my case with the cold precision of a machine. I did not tell a story. I presented a sequence of irrefutable facts. First, I put the transaction flowchart on the main screen, a clean, damning diagram of the money laundering loop, with Rowan Advisory LLC at its heart. "This is the flow of funds," I stated. Next, I showed the metadata from the Mirror directory, highlighting the file creation dates and the user credentials of Finn Rowan. I provided the SHA-256 hash. This is the forensic proof of the original, unaltered data, which the CFO maintained in a hidden directory. Then, I played the security camera footage. The room was silent as they watched the grainy black-and-white image of Celeste plugging her own hardware into their secure server. This is the CFO, on a Friday night, accessing the server that housed the evidence. Finally, I played the key 30-second segment from the lunch recording. Her voice, clear and sharp, filled the silent room. "The payments are routed through our holding account for tax sheltering purposes. They should be logged to account number 7884B. When the audio clicked off, a heavy silence descended. No one looked at Celeste. They were all looking at me. The general counsel leaned over and whispered something in her ear. Celeste's face was a mask of fury, but her voice, when she spoke, was laced with a piteous, wounded tone. "This is a character assassination," she said, her eyes sweeping across the committee members, pleading for sympathy. "This is not about corporate governance. This is a personal vendetta." She turned and pointed a trembling finger at me. "This young woman, she has deep-seated personal issues with me. She lives in my home. This is a family matter, a cry for attention that she has maliciously brought into this boardroom to destroy my reputation." She was trying to reframe the narrative, to turn my evidence into the emotional outburst of an unstable stepdaughter. It was a skillful, desperate gambit. I had anticipated it. I reached into my file folder and slid a single 8x10 photograph across the polished surface of the table. It stopped in the center, directly in front of Arthur Vance. The picture was a close-up of a woman's forearm. From the wrist to the elbow, it was my arm, a dark, ugly constellation of bruises. The distinct, circular shapes of knuckles embedded in the skin stood out in sharp, high-definition color. I had taken care to crop the photo so that no part of my face or any identifiable background was visible. It was an anonymous, clinical depiction of an injury. "Mr. Chairman," I said, my voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "This is a different story, but it's the same hand." Vance stared at the photograph for a long moment. He did not touch it. No one did. It sat there on the table, a silent, obscene testament. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my father. He had been invited to the meeting in his capacity as a minor shareholder, a courtesy extended by Vance. He had been silent the entire time, staring at his hands, which were folded in his lap. Now, his face was ashen. He looked from the photograph to Celeste, his expression one of dawning, gut-wrenching horror. He finally understood. His peace had been paid for with my pain. He looked down again, his shoulders slumping, a man collapsing under the weight of his own silence. Arthur Vance finally broke the stillness. He looked directly at Celeste, his eyes devoid of any warmth. "The preliminary evidence is compelling," he said, the understatement hanging in the air like a guillotine. "This committee recommends to the board that you be placed on immediate, indefinite administrative leave. We will also be retaining an independent, external firm to conduct a full forensic audit of the company's financials, effective immediately." It was then that Celeste's composure finally, catastrophically, shattered. The mask of the calm, competent CFO dissolved, replaced by the raw, snarling face of a cornered animal. She shot to her feet, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. "This is absurd," she shrieked, her voice shrill and ugly. "You have nothing. I was meticulous. I cleaned the logs. I cleaned everything." She had said it, the final, fatal confession, blurted out in a moment of pure, panicked rage. Her words were captured by the sensitive, star-shaped conference microphone in the center of the table, the small green light indicating it was active and recording for the official minutes. The committee members stared at her, their faces a mixture of shock and disgust. As if on cue, the boardroom door opened. 2 men and a woman from Cyrilline's in-house corporate counsel team walked in. The woman in the lead held a thick envelope. "Mr. Vance, Ms. Rowan," she said, her voice calm and professional. "We have a court order for the immediate preservation of all data, personal and corporate, on all of Celeste Rowan's devices, as well as a temporary restraining order preventing her from accessing any Cyrilline Systems property, pending the outcome of the external investigation." It was over. The corporate immune system, slow to activate, had finally identified the cancer and was moving to excise it. Security guards were waiting discreetly in the hallway. Celeste seemed to shrink before my eyes, the power draining out of her, leaving behind only a bitter, trembling woman. Her lawyers guided her toward the door, their hands on her elbows. She didn't look at me. I didn't look at her. I looked at my father. He was still staring at the table, at the empty space where the photograph had been. His face was a ruin. The ledger of his life was finally being audited, and he was finding it deeply, irrevocably in the red. That evening, the house was a vacuum. The oppressive, Manufactured quiet that Celeste had cultivated for years had been replaced by a new, heavier silence, the kind that follows a catastrophic explosion. When the air is thick with dust and the ringing in your ears is the only sound. The dining table was set with its usual, terrifying precision. The porcelain plates were perfectly centered, the silver cutlery aligned with geometric accuracy, the crystal water glasses gleaming under the recessed lighting. It was a stage set for a play whose actors had forgotten their lines. Celeste had cooked dinner, an act of defiant normalcy that was more menacing than any outburst. A roasted chicken sat on a platter, its skin perfectly browned, growing cold. We sat, the three of us, in our designated chairs. Celeste was at the head of the table, as always, but the woman there was a stranger. Her face was bare, stripped of the makeup that was her daily armor. Without the sharp lines of lipstick and eyeliner, her features seemed softer, her mouth thinner, her eyes startlingly empty. The performance was over. The powerful CFO was gone, leaving only this quiet, hollowed-out woman. My father sat to her left, his posture stooped, his gaze fixed on the intricate pattern of his napkin. He hadn't spoken a full sentence to me since we left the boardroom. I did not eat. I watched the condensation form on my water glass, each tiny droplet a witness. The only sounds were the faint hum of the refrigerator and the quiet, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, counting down the final minutes of this life. It was my father who finally broke the silence. He didn't look at me. He spoke to the table, his voice a low, raw whisper, roughened by a grief he was only just beginning to process. "Are you sure you want to continue with this, Harper?" It was a question born of a lifetime of cowardice. He wasn't asking for my sake. He was asking for his. He was asking if there was any way to undo it all, to put the monster back in the box and pretend it had never gotten out, to return to the fragile, toxic peace he had mistaken for a life. I met his gaze, holding it until he was forced to look at me. "I've been sure," I said, my voice as clear and cold as the water in my glass. "Since the night the spoon broke." I saw the memory hit him, a physical impact. He flinched. The image of that splintered wooden spoon on the kitchen counter, an event he had chosen to ignore, finally lodging itself in his conscience. He looked away, defeated. From the head of the table, Celeste made a sound, a low hiss that was barely audible. I turned to her. Her eyes were no longer empty. They were filled with a cold, pure hatred. "You will regret this," she whispered. The threat had no force behind it. It was the ghost of a threat, an echo of the power she once wielded. I reached into the leather portfolio resting on the empty chair beside me. I pulled out a single, thick white envelope. I didn't say a word. I simply slid it across the polished wood of the table. It came to a stop directly in front of her plate. Her eyes flickered down to it. Inside was a copy of the official notice from the board, detailing her immediate suspension. Tucked behind it was a copy of the court-issued protective order for me, the whistleblower, legally barring her from any form of contact or retaliation. It was the minutes from the meeting, formalized on paper. It was the rulebook she had always ignored, now being used to bind her. She looked from the envelope back to my face. A bitter, jagged laugh escaped her lips, a sound like breaking glass. "This family," she said, her voice dripping with venom, "has lost all of its face because of you. All of our standing, our reputation, gone." She was still clinging to the wreckage of her own narrative, where appearances were the only currency that mattered. "This family," I replied, my voice calm and steady, "can finally breathe now that your mask is off." A profound stillness followed my words. The grandfather clock ticked. My father pushed his chair back, the legs scraping softly against the floor. He stood up. He walked around the table, gathering the plates. Celeste's untouched, his own, mine. He carried them into the kitchen. He did not say a word. A moment later, we heard a sound that had been absent from this house for over a decade, the sound of the kitchen faucet turning on, of water rushing into the sink, the sound of a man washing the dishes. For the first time, the gentle splash and clatter of porcelain replaced the memory of splintering wood. A cleansing was taking place. An old order was being washed away. Celeste stared at the kitchen doorway, her expression one of utter disbelief. This small domestic act was a betrayal more profound than anything that had happened in the boardroom. It was the final vote of no confidence. Her reign was over, not just at Cyrilene, but here, in the heart of her kingdom. She stood, her movements stiff and robotic, and walked out of the dining room without another word, leaving the white envelope sitting on the table like a tombstone. I went upstairs. I did not say goodnight to my father. There was nothing left to say. I entered my room and locked the door. The click of the deadbolt, a firm, final period on the sentence of my childhood. I sat on the edge of my bed in the dark, the faint moonlight striping the floor. I pulled out my phone. The screen cast a cool blue light on my face. I opened my encrypted messaging app and sent a single short message to Murray. Tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. Transfer the complete, hashed data package to the lead auditor. The key is in their possession. She replied instantly, by the book, it will be done. I set the phone down. I stood and walked to my closet, pulling out a clean, soft, long-sleeved cotton shirt. I put it on. For years, shirts like this had been my armor, my camouflage, the tools I used to hide the bruises, to maintain the fiction of a normal life. They were symbols of my shame and my silence. Tonight, it felt different. I wasn't hiding anything. There was nothing left to hide. The evidence was no longer on my skin. It was on a server, logged and verified, about to be entered into the official record. I lay down in my bed, pulling the covers up. I could still hear the faint, steady sound of my father in the kitchen, washing away the years of complicity, one plate at a time. I closed my eyes, the soft cotton of the sleeves resting against my arms. The shirt was no longer an instrument of concealment. It was a memorial, a reminder of the cost of my safety, a uniform I had earned, and I would wear it to remember. The following Monday, the company received a summons. A mandatory all-hands meeting was called for 10:03 a.m. in the main auditorium. The email from the CEO, Mark Ellison, was brief and devoid of details. A corporate communication designed to maximize attendance through sheer anxiety. The entire company, from the mailroom clerks to the senior VPs, filed into the cavernous space under the harsh, white glare of the overhead lights. The air was thick with nervous energy and whispered speculation. I took a seat in the middle of the room, an anonymous face in a sea of colleagues. My father was there, seated in a reserved section for shareholders, looking small and frail. The lead auditor, a stern-faced woman from the external firm, walked onto the stage. She did not waste time with pleasantries. Her report was a masterpiece of brutal efficiency. Our forensic audit, conducted over the past 72 hours, has confirmed significant and deliberate financial malfeasance originating in the office of the Chief Financial Officer, she began, her voice amplified throughout the silent hall. Behind her, the massive presentation screen flickered to life. It showed the same clean, simple flowchart I had created, now stamped with the official logo of the auditing firm. The diagram showed the money flowing from Cyrilene, through Rowan Advisory LLC and the secondary shell company, and finally circling back as a donation to Cyrilene Cares. The auditor didn't need to add commentary. The image was a self-contained narrative of the crime. The Cyrilene Cares logo, with its wholesome image of hands nurturing a green sprout, blinked rhythmically on the screen, a slow, pulsing heartbeat of hypocrisy that seemed to mock the entire room. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. The auditor concluded her summary. The board is considering its legal options, but has determined that transparency with our employees and stakeholders is paramount. She then yielded the floor to the CEO. Mark Ellison, a man who usually exuded a folksy, confident charm, looked grim. "Before we move forward," he said, "I have agreed to a request from Celeste Rowan to address you all for 2 minutes. Celeste?" A side door opened, and she walked onto the stage. She was dressed impeccably in a dark navy suit, her face a perfect mask of composed dignity. She looked like the victim, a leader forced to endure a public humiliation. She walked to the podium, adjusted the microphone, and looked out at the silent, watching faces. She was preparing to give the performance of her life, to spin a story of a complex misunderstanding, a simple accounting error blown out of proportion by overzealous auditors and internal enemies. "My dear colleagues," she began, her voice resonating with a carefully practiced sincerity. "For 10 years, I have dedicated my life to the financial health and integrity of this company. The complex transactions you see on that screen are not what they appear. They are a legitimate, if unconventional, strategy for managing." It was time. I stood up. My movement was a small disruption in the vast, still auditorium, but it was enough. Heads turned. Ellison looked at me with irritation. Celeste paused, a flicker of genuine hatred flashing in her eyes, before being replaced by a look of pained confusion. I raised my hand, the gesture calm and deliberate. "Mr. Ellison," I said, my voice carrying in the charged silence. "I ask for a point of clarification for the record. With the committee's permission, I would like to supplement the auditor's timeline with a time-stamped audio recording that directly corroborates the nature and specific account details of this strategy." Vance, the committee chairman, was seated in the front row. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. That was all the authorization I needed. From a technician's booth at the back of the auditorium, a prearranged signal was answered. A sharp, clear audio tone echoed through the speakers, the sound of a recording being played, and then Celeste's own voice, crisp and condescending, filled the room. "The payments are routed through our holding account for tax sheltering purposes. They should be logged to account number 7884B. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. The quiet murmuring in the crowd ceased, replaced by a collective, sharp intake of breath. It was one thing to see a flowchart. It was another thing entirely to hear the crime confessed in the clear, confident voice of the perpetrator. Celeste froze at the podium, her face ashen. The account number, a meaningless string of characters to most, was now a brand, an indelible mark of her guilt spoken in her own words. Before she could react, the lead auditor stepped forward again, as if taking a cue. "If I may add to that," she said, her voice cutting through the stunned silence, "the recording provides context for this." The screen behind them changed. The flowchart vanished, replaced by the grainy black and white footage from the server room camera. The timestamp in the corner read 2241. The entire company watched as their CFO, their trusted financial guardian, furtively looked around before plugging a black external hard drive into the company's secure server. The evidence was absolute, visual, and undeniable. There was no story she could tell, no narrative she could spin that could possibly explain away the images and sounds of her own actions. The trap had not just been sprung, its steel jaws had closed in front of 1,000 witnesses. CEO Mark Ellison stepped back to the podium. His face was set like stone. He looked directly at Celeste, who stood motionless, a statue of her own ruin. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Celeste Rowan," he said, the words precise and final. "Pursuant to the terms of your employment contract and the bylaws of this corporation, your employment with Cyrilline Systems is terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building." 2 uniformed guards, who had been standing discreetly by the side doors, moved onto the stage. They did not touch her aggressively. One of them placed a hand gently, but firmly, on her shoulder. It was a gesture that was both polite and absolute, a courteous and complete removal of power. She didn't resist. She seemed to collapse inward. All the fight, all the arrogance, gone. They guided her off the stage, and she disappeared through the side door. The public execution was complete. A palpable sense of relief and shock settled over the room, but the auditor wasn't finished. "One final matter," she announced. her voice pulling everyone's attention back to the stage. In the course of our investigation into the primary fraud, we uncovered a secondary, much smaller discretionary fund, also managed by Ms. Rowan. It was coded as an Executive Family and Friends Loyalty Bonus account. This account appears to have been funded by skimming fractions of a percent from the expense accounts of other senior executives. She paused, letting the implication of this new layer of theft sink in. There was only one regular beneficiary of this secret fund. The screen changed again. It showed a simple table. On the left, the name of the fund. On the right, a single name under the heading Recipient. Richard Lane. A gasp went through the auditorium. I turned my head and looked at my father. He was staring at the screen, his face a mask of pure, uncomprehending panic. He looked like he had been struck by lightning. He shot to his feet, his movements clumsy and jerky. "No, that's a mistake," he stammered, his voice weak, pathetic. He was speaking to no one in particular, to the entire room. Celeste told me it was a legitimate long-term shareholder bonus, a reward for my loyalty to the company. I thought it was legal. His words trailed off into a desperate, mumbled plea. He was a man drowning, and he was grabbing for anything that might keep him afloat. I felt 1,000 pairs of eyes turn to me. They had just seen me as the hero, the whistleblower who had taken down a corrupt executive. Now, they saw me as the daughter of a co-conspirator, a beneficiary of the very corruption I had exposed. I stood up again. I walked from my seat down the center aisle, my footsteps echoing in the silent hall. I walked up the small set of stairs to the stage and approached the podium that Celeste had just abandoned. I looked out at the sea of faces, at my colleagues, at the board members, at the ruins of my father. I leaned into the microphone. I did not speak to him. I spoke to everyone. "Safety," I said, my voice clear and unwavering, amplified to every corner of the room, "is the truth, no matter how much it hurts." As Celeste was led from the stage, the bright, flat light of the auditorium seemed to bleach all the color from the scene, rendering it stark and two-dimensional. There was no drama in her exit. It was a simple administrative action, a revocation of privileges. The 1,000 people in the room watched in a profound, collective silence. It was not the silence of awe or celebration, but the heavy, dense quiet of a system rebooting, of a massive error being purged from the code. The air was still, sterile, like a freshly balanced spreadsheet where the final sum has been verified and all the chaotic variables have been resolved. CEO Mark Ellison turned to me. I was still standing at the podium, the microphone a cool, metallic object under my hand. He walked over, his expression unreadable. He did not offer a handshake or a smile. He simply stood beside me for a moment, surveying the silent crowd, before turning his head slightly to speak to me, his voice low and meant only for the two of us, though the microphone was still live. "Thank you for doing the right thing, Harper," he said. The words were a formality, a necessary closing entry for the official record. There was no applause from the audience. There was no ovation. There was only this necessary, unnerving quiet, an acknowledgement that what had happened was not a victory, but a painful but essential correction. It was the sound of a company holding its breath, hoping the foundation was still sound now that a rotten pillar had been removed. I nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement, and stepped away from the podium. I walked back down the aisle, the sea of faces parting for me. No one spoke to me. No one met my eye. I was no longer just Harper Lane, the risk analyst. I was an agent of consequence, an event, and no one knew quite how to categorize me yet. Back at my desk, the world outside my window seemed unnaturally sharp and clear. I ignored the flurry of instant messages and emails popping up on my screen. I had only one more task to perform in this role. I opened a new email. The recipient was the head of human resources and my direct supervisor. The subject: resignation and internal transfer request. The email was short and precise. "Please accept this as my formal resignation from the position of lead risk analyst in the Government Contracts Division, effective immediately. I would like to formally request a transfer to the newly formed Ethics and Risk Oversight Group. As discussed with Mr. Vance, I believe my skills are best suited to developing the proactive frameworks that will prevent future incidents of this nature. I was not just leaving a job, I was redefining my function. I had spent years analyzing risk that had already been created. Now, I would move to the source. I would be the one writing the code, building the firewalls, ensuring the system was designed for integrity from the ground up. I was choosing a path where I would always be looking forward, not over my shoulder. I hit send. The final entry in that part of my career ledger was complete. A shadow fell over my desk. I looked up. It was my father. He looked a decade older than he had that morning. The public humiliation had broken something deep inside him. He stood there for a long moment, his hands twisting in front of him, a man searching for a script he had never been given. "You can hate me," he finally said, his voice a dry rasp. "I would understand. I deserve it." He was offering me a familiar, simple transaction. His guilt in exchange for my anger, an emotional payment to clear his conscience. I considered his words, analyzing them as I would any other piece of data. Hate was an investment, a liability that would occupy space on my own balance sheet for years to come. It was an inefficient use of resources. I shook my head slowly, my gaze steady. "I don't hate you," I said, and the words were true, stripped of all emotion. I choose to acknowledge, not to hate. I let the word hang there. Acknowledge. It was a term from my world. It meant to record a fact, to enter it into the log, to confirm its existence without necessarily passing judgment. I acknowledge the weakness. I acknowledge the silence. I acknowledge the part you played. The data is now part of the permanent record. There is nothing more to be done. He seemed to shrink, understanding that the absolution he sought was not something I was capable of or interested in providing. He simply nodded, a man with an unpayable debt, and walked away. That afternoon, I walked into the downtown police precinct. The air smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. I didn't ask for a specific officer. I went to the front desk and handed the woman on duty a sealed evidence bag. Inside was a high-resolution print of the last photograph I had taken, the one I had shown the board. I also handed her a thumb drive containing the digital file, along with a sworn affidavit detailing the time, date, and context of the injury, referencing the now public corporate investigation. "This is for the domestic file you have on Celeste Rowan," I said. It was a cold case, one I had never pursued. Now, I was simply adding the final piece of corroborating evidence. The officer took the bag, tagged it, and gave me a receipt. The transaction was complete. I walked out into the late afternoon sun, took out my phone, navigated to the secure folder, and deleted the entire archive of images. I then wiped the deleted data cache. The evidence had been transferred to the proper authorities. The file was closed. It was no longer my data to hold. That night, for the first time in years, I cooked a proper meal in that silent house. My father was gone, having checked into a hotel. I was alone. I made a simple, nourishing soup, the scent of vegetables and herbs filling the sterile kitchen. I reached into a drawer and pulled out a brand new wooden spoon, its surface smooth and unmarked. I used it to stir the soup, the gentle scraping sound against the bottom of the pot, a quiet, reassuring rhythm. I left the spoon resting on the stovetop when I was done. It was whole. It was an instrument of creation, not of violence. There was no sound of splintering wood. There was only the gentle steam rising from the soup. Before I went to sleep, I sat at my personal laptop and opened my file directory. I navigated to the folder that had contained my entire life's work for the past several months. The name on the screen read, Project, Safety. It was a project that was now complete, but the name was no longer accurate. Safety wasn't a project. It wasn't an external goal to be achieved. I right-clicked on the folder, rename. My fingers typed the new name, the final and most important truth I had learned. Safety equals me. I opened my private digital journal, a single encrypted text file, to make the final entry. My fingers paused over the keyboard as I distilled the entire experience down to its essential truth, the final balancing of the account. Revenge isn't about getting even, it's about balancing the books. I closed the file. I shut down the laptop. The screen went black. There was no music. The end. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. So drop a comment below and let's connect and share our thoughts. If this story resonated with you, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like. And finally, if you want to help this story be heard by more people, please hit that hype button. It really helps.